Welcome to No Longer Conformed. I'm Erik Garthe. We are in class with Joseph. Lessons in God's Plan. In this session, we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 38, verses 1 to 30, the reality of mercy in God's plan. Let's just take a moment and look at a couple of verses. In Genesis 37 and verse 36, it reads from the end of our last session, "Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard." And then if we skip over today, the chapter for this session, chapter 38, and we go to chapter 39 and verse 1, it reads, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there." Right in the middle of Joseph's sale to Potiphar in Egypt, there is an interlude. Chapter 38, I guess it's a meanwhile back in Canaan kind of moment. It's known in theological circles as the Judah interlude. And listen, it's one nasty story. It is not family viewing material. Let me just throw this question out there. What is a chapter full of wickedness, deception, and immorality doing in the middle of Joseph's biography? Well, let me tell you, much debate and ink have been spent wrestling with this passage. Should it be placed here or not? Well, I'll leave that issue to the more brilliant theological minds. I'm simple enough to work with the plain reading of the texts and go from there. The events of this chapter are contemporary to Joseph. In 38 verse 1, it says "at that time," so it's contemporary. It reads in chapter 38 verse 1, "It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira." The events are genealogically in the right place. Well, how is that? Well, Joseph is gone. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi are out of favor with Jacob for incest and treachery. Reuben slept with Rachel's maid, Bilhah, the mother of Dan and Naphtali. That's over in chapter 35 of Genesis, in verse 22. Simeon and Levi killed the Shechemites, avenging the honor of their sister Dinah, who was raped by a prince of Shechem. That's in Genesis 34, verse 25 and verse 30. So with Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, Numbers 1, 2, and 3, number 4, Judah, it was natural for Judah to rise in stature like a firstborn and become prominent in the biblical record. We will see quite a contrast. Judah's immoral character and Joseph's virtuous character. This really highlights the need for a move to Egypt. Dwelling in Canaan was destroying Judah's line. Egypt would provide a safe environment for racial and religious isolation, and the clan would be preserved intact. Genesis 45 and verse 7 reads, "And God sent me before you," Joseph speaking to his brothers, "to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Well, with that backdrop, let's rejoin the narrative of this Judah interlude in some detail. First, we see Judah's bloodline defiled in verses 2 through 5. The genealogy was becoming impure. 3 sons he had by a Canaanite wife. So it's integration of Jew and Gentile. Verse 2, "And Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son, and called his name Shelah. He was at Chezib when she bore him." And second, we then witness God's judgment in verses 6 through 10. 2 of Judah's sons were executed directly by God. The firstborn for some unnamed sin, and the secondborn Onan for blatant rebellion. Look at verse 6. "Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him." All it says. "And Judah said to Onan, 'Go in to your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother.' But Onan knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give her an heir. He should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore, he killed him also." Onan rejected his obligation to marry his brother's wife and give him an heir. Listen, it's not family viewing, but I assume you get the picture. Verse 11 records Judah's vow to Er's widow to secure his line, even if it is impure. Tamar trusted her father-in-law's word in vain, and we'll see that later in verse 14. But verse 11 says, "Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, 'Remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown.' For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house." Verse 12 kind of fills in some history for us. It says, now in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. Okay, that's the situation. Now let's watch Tamar's plan develop in verses 13 to the beginning of verse 16. She took matters into her own hands. Tamar obviously felt that she could easily deceive Judah, which really says a lot about his moral reputation and the integrity of his character. He viewed her as a prostitute. Verse 13, "And it was told Tamar, saying, Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the ground on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. At this point, Judah had become completely worldly. He gave in to the temptation, he negotiated the price, and he gave a pledge to secure the deal. Look at the second part of verse 16 down to verse 19. And so she said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" So she said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" And he said, "I will send a young goat from the flock." So she said, "Will you give me a pledge till you send it?" And then he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" So she said, "Your signet and cord and your staff that is in your hand." Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. Let me tell you something. The lure of sin blinds a man to the consequences that it could potentially produce. Someone wrote very wisely, "Sin takes us farther than we had intended to go and keeps us longer than we planned to stay." Yeah, it makes me think of the 4 laws of the harvest. You reap what you sow. You reap where you sow. You reap how you sow, meaning the amount. You reap forth in a different season than you sow. Many people sin and think they've gotten away with it until suddenly your reputation is at stake. Judah had to publicly search for a prostitute to complete the deal and get his pledge back. Your sin will eventually be exposed. Look at verses 20 down to verse 23. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside?" And they said, "There is no harlot in this place." So he returned to Judah and said, "I cannot find her." And the men of the place said, "There was no harlot in this place." Then Judah said, "Let her take them for herself, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her." Listen, Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. Don't miss these. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Take a look at verse 24. It shows the typical, very typical judgmental attitude of sinners toward other sinners whom they view to be worse sinners than themselves. Look at verse 24. And it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry." And so Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Judah had to be feeling good at this point, in control. But quickly the tables were turned. Listen, it was harvest time for Judah's sowing of sin. Verses 25 and 26 don't declare Tamar morally right. They just show she was more committed to maintaining the heritage of Ur. Verse 25, when she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please determine whose these are, the signet and cord and staff. And so Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her Shelah, my son. And he never knew her again. The end of the story is that twins were born of prostitution and incest by deception, basically by sin. Perez means breach or break through. Look at verses 27 to 30. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you breach through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. What's the difference? What is the significance of this event? Well, we see God's blessing on Judah's line. This narrative establishes the background for his act of mercy. The messianic line of Jesus Christ goes straight through Perez. A child of immorality broke through into the line. Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. In his mercy, God took the immoral produce of Judah's sin, and by his grace restored a pure line through Judah, the genealogical line of the Messiah. That's the purpose of the Judah interlude in the record of the life of Joseph. You have a great day.